Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker. Graham Hancock was formerly East Africa correspondent of The Economist and co-editor of New Internationalist magazine. He was for several years editor of Africa Guide, Middle East Annual Review, Latin America Annual Review, and Asia and Pacific Annual Review. From 1979 to 1981, he also edited the Traveller magazine, published by the World Expeditionary Association. Graham Hancock's previous books include Journey Through Pakistan, Ethiopia, The Challenge of Hunger, AIDS, The Deadly Epidemic, Lords of Poverty, African Ark, Peoples of the Horn, and the international bestseller, The Sign and the Seal, A Quest for the Lost Ark of the Covenant. In a review of The Sign and the Seal, Graham Hancock was credited by the Guardian newspaper with having invented a new genre, an intellectual who'd done it by a do-it-yourself sleuth. Graham Hancock has appeared on television with Michael Palin in his recent Pole to Pole series, and on BBC and CNN, as well as the National Geographic's Explorer series in stories related to The Sign and the Seal. Graham Hancock's most recent book, Fingerprints of the Gods, documents his quest for a lost civilization of antiquity. It became an instant bestseller when it was published in Britain on the 10th of April 1995, spending 6 consecutive weeks at #1 in the Sunday Times National Bestseller list, a further 6 weeks at #2, and 23 weeks in the list in total. Published in paperback in February of this year, the book immediately jumped again to the top of the bestseller list. It has been translated into a dozen languages, and by March of this year, in addition to UK sales of 90,000 copies in hardback and 80,000 copies in paperback, has sold more than 50,000 copies in hardback in the United States, and would you believe 180,000 copies in hardback in Japan. Graham Hancock is, of course, also the author, with Robert Bauval, of Keeper of Genesis, a radical new investigation into the antiquity and function of the Great Sphinx and the 3 Great Pyramids of Giza. Keeper of Genesis was first published in Britain on the 7th of May 1996 and will appear in the United States, where it's entitled The Message of the Sphinx, on the 9th of June 1996. And as you heard earlier, I'm delighted, I'm sure you are, but not too surprised to discover that Graham and Robert's latest work, Keeper of Genesis, has now shot to #1 here in the United Kingdom's bestseller list. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please put your hands together and warmly welcome Mr. Graham Hancock.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks. I've got volume here, have I? Yes. Thank you very much indeed for all being here today. I was just listening to what Graham Birdsall was saying about my past career, and I was thinking how I got into all of this from being a journalist working on The Economist. It actually happened because of repeated visits that I made to Ethiopia, and the claim that Ethiopia makes to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant. this claim was ridiculed by scholars, but as I began to look into it, I found that it rests on very solid foundations, and I ended up writing The Sign and the Seal. And that book, the research on that book, took me to Egypt, because, of course, the origins of the Ark of the Covenant lie in Egypt and in the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. And when I went to Egypt and began looking into that civilization, I realized that I was confronted by an extraordinary mystery, a mystery that Egyptologists had never satisfactorily explained, or at any rate, if they tried to, their explanations certainly didn't make sense to me. I remember reading a book called Archaic Egypt by Professor Walter Emery, now deceased, but a great authority on his subject. And he drew attention to curious similarities between ancient Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia and the archaic Egyptian civilization. And while he could find no strong evidence of a direct influence of ancient Egypt on Sumer, or of Sumer on ancient Egypt, he found that these similarities couldn't be explained away as coincidence, and he put forward an interesting hypothesis. He asked, what if an earlier unidentified civilization, a remote third-party civilization, had influenced both Egypt and Sumer, passed down a legacy to both of them, and what if the similarities between these two cultures were explained by that remote common influence? And I thought this was a very interesting idea and one worth pursuing further. And in fact, more than anything else, it was that seed planted by Professor Walter Emery that led me to research and write Fingerprints of the Gods. I could not have written that book at all, or indeed developed in the direction that I have developed as a writer and researcher, if it hadn't been for my partner and wife, Santa Faya, whose photographs we're going to be looking at here. She's certainly been the most profound influence on my life. And I did some bad stuff back in the 1980s, which, when I look back on it, I regret it. But we have to live with our mistakes, and I'm very grateful to Santa for putting me right. Many other people also who I need to thank, and without whom Fingerprints could not have been written. Researchers, people working in the field of the mystery of the origins of civilization over the last 100 years or so, going back as far as Ignatius Donnelly, who wrote Atlantis, the Antediluvian World in the 1880s.